A homeless Navy SEAL bought a condemned ranger station for $10. Then his dog uncovered a buried death they lied about. Homeless at 56, former Navy SEAL Ethan Cole thought he was buying a forgotten ranger station deep in Idaho's Bitterroot Mountains. But the moment his retired military dog, Shadow, stepped inside the abandoned cabin, he started growling at something buried beneath the floor. Days later, Ethan would uncover a hidden underground tunnel, a dead ranger no one ever found, and a wildfire secret powerful men spent 40 years trying to erase. Comment 1 if you'd live alone in the mountains, or 0 if you'd never make it one night. And tell us where you're watching from. The bus station in Missoula smelled like burned coffee, wet boots, and old exhaustion. Snowmelt dripped steadily from the edge of the roof outside, tapping against the cracked concrete like a leaking clock. The storm that had rolled through western Montana the night before was finally moving east toward the mountains, leaving behind dirty piles of snow along the sidewalks and a cold wind sharp enough to sting exposed skin. Ethan Cole sat alone beneath the flickering fluorescent lights near the back wall of the station, his hands wrapped around a paper cup that had gone cold an hour earlier. 56 years old, homeless, and down to his last $10. Across from him, curled tightly beside the bench with his nose tucked beneath his tail, lay Shadow. The German shepherd's black coat had faded around the muzzle with age, silver spreading through the fur like frost across dark earth. Scars marked the dog's shoulders beneath the thick winter coat. One ear carried a small tear from a mission years earlier that Ethan still dreamed about some nights. Shadow slept lightly. Military dogs always did. Even retired ones. Every few minutes, the shepherd's ears twitched at sounds most people never noticed. The hiss of bus brakes outside, boots crossing wet tile, the metallic slam of a locker door somewhere near the bathrooms. Ethan understood that kind of sleep, the kind where your body never fully trusted the world enough to rest. A young couple entered the station carrying fast food bags and talking loudly about ski conditions outside Bozeman. They glanced toward Ethan for only a second before looking away again. Most people looked away. The beard helped with that. So did the old military backpack sitting beside him with duct tape wrapped around one torn strap, or the faded olive-green field jacket that still carried a ghost of desert dust deep in the seams, no amount of washing ever fully removed. He looked like exactly what he was. A man life had slowly pushed to the edges. The overhead television mounted near the ticket counter played a morning news report with no sound. Ethan watched the captions scroll beneath footage of politicians arguing in Washington, while the station manager swept melted snow toward the door with bored, angry strokes. Nobody noticed the old SEAL sitting in the corner. That was fine with him. For a long time after Afghanistan, Ethan had wanted nothing more than to disappear. The problem was that eventually he had succeeded. His marriage had collapsed first. Then the contracting jobs dried up. Then came the drinking. Not the violent kind. Not the stories people like to tell in movies. Ethan's damage had been quieter than that. He simply stopped being able to exist around other people for very long. Crowded grocery stores made his chest tighten. Fireworks sent him searching instinctively for cover before his brain caught up with reality. Sleep became a place full of dead men calling his name in mountain snow. His wife lasted 6 years longer than most would have. Claire had been 16 when her mother finally packed the last box and left. Ethan still remembered standing in the driveway while Claire sat silently in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead because looking at him hurt too much. That had been 8 years ago. He had not heard her voice since. Shadow lifted his head suddenly. The dog stared toward the entrance. Ethan followed the movement automatically, instinct older than thought. 2 men entered wearing orange highway jackets dusted with snow. County workers by the look of them. One carried a clipboard under his arm, while the other complained loudly about road washouts farther south near the Idaho line. "Telling you nobody's buying that place," the taller man muttered. "County's been trying to unload it for years." His partner laughed. "Hell, I wouldn't stay there for free." They moved toward the vending machines. Ethan looked away again, but the words lingered. Nobody's buying that place. A few hours later, after the station manager informed him he couldn't sleep there another night unless he bought a ticket somewhere, Ethan found himself walking 3 blocks through freezing drizzle toward the public library. Shadow padded silently beside him. The dog stayed close in cities. Too many bad memories tied to alleys and strangers moving too fast. The library was warm enough that Ethan almost turned around and left immediately, because warmth made him tired now. He signed onto one of the public computers using a temporary guest pass and stared blankly at the screen while people around him scrolled social media and checked email. He had no email left to check. No one wrote anymore. Mostly he searched for temporary work, trail clearing, fence repair, remote firewatch jobs, anything isolated enough that he wouldn't have to explain the way his hands sometimes shook after helicopters passed overhead. A county auction link caught his eye by accident, saying, "Surplus land and structure sales, Idaho State County Holdings." Mostly abandoned storage sheds, old maintenance buildings. Then one listing stopped him cold. Black Hollow Ranger Station, Bitterroot Wilderness Region. Starting bid, $10. Ethan leaned closer. The listing included 3 grainy photographs taken under cloudy skies. A weathered log building beside a dark lake, pine forest pressing tight around it, a rusted fire lookout tower rising above the trees like a forgotten skeleton. The description was brief. Condemned property, unsafe structural conditions, restricted access during winter months, no active utilities. 14 miles from nearest maintained roadway. And then one final line. County assumes no liability for injury, wildlife encounters, or structural collapse. Ethan stared at the photographs for a long time. Something tightened deep in his chest. Not fear. Recognition. Places like that used to feel normal to him. Mountain silence. Isolation. Cold air sharp enough to clear your thoughts. During training in Alaska decades earlier, Ethan had spent nearly 3 months stationed in terrain so remote, the only sounds at night were wind moving through black spruce and the distant cracking of frozen rivers. Back then solitude had felt clean, necessary, before the war poisoned it. He looked down at Shadow. "You ever get tired of people, huh?" Shadow's ears twitched. Ethan gave a dry laugh. "Yeah, me too." The library windows rattled softly as wind pushed rain against the glass. Outside, Missoula traffic crawled through wet streets beneath low gray clouds. Inside, the computer screen glowed quietly in front of him. Black Hollow Ranger Station. The words felt strange in his mind, like something half-remembered. Ethan opened the map attachment. The station sat deep inside Idaho wilderness near the Bitterroot Range, surrounded by ridges, dense forest, an alpine lake. No nearby towns except a tiny settlement called Elk River, nearly 40 miles south. Exactly the kind of place nobody wanted. Exactly the kind of place Ethan understood. Beside him, Shadow suddenly stood. The movement startled Ethan enough that his pulse jumped. The dog stepped closer to the screen. Then Shadow did something he had not done in months. He growled. Low, quiet, focused. Ethan frowned. "What is it?" Shadow stared directly at the photograph of the ranger station. Not barking. Not afraid. Alert. Every muscle tense beneath his coat. Ethan felt cold move slowly through his stomach. The shepherd had spent 7 years deployed beside him overseas. Bomb detection. Tracking. Mountain patrol operations. Shadow trusted instinct more than sight, and Ethan had learned long ago never to ignore either one. He looked back at the screen. The image showed only trees, the old station, the tower. But now Ethan noticed something else. One upstairs window facing the lake. Dark. Except for what looked almost like a reflection. No. Movement. He blinked. It vanished. Probably rain distortion on the old camera lens. Still, Shadow continued staring. The library suddenly felt too warm, too crowded. Ethan leaned back slowly in the chair. "You think there's something wrong with that place?" Shadow looked at him briefly, then back to the screen. The old dog's ears remained rigid. Ethan exhaled through his nose. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere far off over the mountains. He looked once more at the listing. $10. That was all he had left in the world. $10 between him and sleeping under another bridge somewhere. $10 between him and disappearing for good. For several seconds, Ethan simply sat there listening to the rain strike the library windows. Then he reached for the mouse. The purchase form loaded slowly. When the confirmation screen finally appeared, Ethan stared at it without moving. Property transfer pending. Black Hollow Ranger Station. Owned by Ethan Cole. For the first time in a long while, something unfamiliar moved quietly beneath the exhaustion inside him. Not happiness, not hope exactly, but maybe the faint outline of direction. Shadow finally stopped growling. The shepherd stepped beside Ethan's chair and pressed his head gently against Ethan's leg, the way he always had after difficult missions overseas. Steady, grounding. Outside, the storm deepened over the Bitterroots. Far beyond Missoula, far beyond the highways and towns, somewhere deep in the mountains, an abandoned ranger station waited beneath dark pine trees beside a frozen lake, and neither Ethan nor Shadow had any idea that the place had been waiting for them for a very long time. They left Missoula before sunrise with everything Ethan still owned strapped to his back. The bus carried them west under a dull gray sky, past gas stations, closed motels, bare cottonwoods, and fields still wet from the last spring storm. Ethan sat by the window with Shadow stretched at his feet, one hand resting on the shepherd's shoulder as the world rolled by in long, lonely ribbons of highway. Nobody spoke to him. That suited him fine. On the seat beside him sat a folded printout from the library, the auction confirmation, the rough county map, the access warning written in plain language that would have scared off any reasonable buyer. 14 miles from nearest maintained road. Seasonal washouts. No rescue services guaranteed. Ethan read the words again and again until they stopped looking like a warning and started looking like an invitation. By noon, the bus dropped them at a small stop near the Idaho line. From there, Ethan caught a ride with a trucker hauling fencing supplies south. The driver was a heavy-set man in his 60s with tobacco stains on his fingers and an old country station humming low through the speakers. He asked Ethan where he was headed. "Black Hollow," Ethan said. The driver glanced at him once. Then he looked at Shadow. "Not much out there." "That's the point." The driver gave a dry chuckle, but there was no humor in it. Folks usually say that before they figure out how quiet can get. Ethan said nothing. He already knew. Late afternoon found them standing at the edge of an old Forest Service road where the pavement ended without ceremony. Beyond it, the world narrowed to mud, snow patches, fallen branches, and a thin road climbing into dark timber. The trucker left Ethan beside a leaning wooden sign half covered in lichen. Black Hollow Access Road, seasonal route, travel not advised. The truck rumbled away, its taillights disappearing around the last bend, leaving Ethan and Shadow in a silence so complete it seemed to swallow the sound of the engine after it was gone. For a while, Ethan stood still. The air smelled of wet pine, cold stone, and thawing earth. Above the trees, the Bitterroot ridges rose in jagged blue-gray layers, their upper slopes still packed with snow. Clouds moved low over the peaks. Thin sunlight broke through in pale strips and vanished again. Shadow stepped forward first. The old dog lowered his nose to the road, sniffed once, then looked back at Ethan as if waiting for orders. Ethan shifted the weight of his pack. "Yeah," he muttered. "I know." They started walking. The first miles were easy in the way hard things are easy at the beginning. The road climbed gradually through lodgepole pine and old burned timber. Snowmelt ran in silver threads across the ruts. Every few hundred yards, Ethan had to step around fallen branches or balance across washed-out sections where the road had collapsed toward the creek below. His knees complained first, then his back. At 56, the body remembered old injuries better than old victories. A bad landing from a training jump in Coronado. A shoulder torn during a mountain extraction. Shrapnel scars that ached when the weather shifted. Shadow moved with quiet discipline, never ranging far, always checking back. His gait was slower than it had been in the old days, but steady, loyal, determined. By late afternoon, the road turned steeper. Snow patches thickened in the shaded bends. Ethan's boots sank ankle-deep in icy slush. Twice he slipped and caught himself against pine trunks, breathing hard while his pulse thudded in his ears. Then came the sound. Distant at first. A deep, rhythmic thump rolling between the ridges. Ethan froze. Shadow froze too. The sound grew louder, bouncing through the valley until it seemed to come from every direction at once. Helicopter blades. For 1 second, Ethan was standing in Idaho spring mud. The next, he was back on a mountain slope half a world away, snow whipping sideways under a black sky, radio chatter breaking apart in his ear, red tracer fire rising from the valley floor, men shouting names he had spent years trying not to hear. His breath vanished. His hand went automatically toward a rifle that was not there. The pack slid from his shoulder and hit the mud. The helicopter was only a civilian search and rescue aircraft passing somewhere beyond the ridge. It never came close. It never saw him. But Ethan was already gone. His vision narrowed. His heart hammered so hard it hurt. The trees bent and stretched around him. The smell of wet pine became diesel smoke and cordite. The cold air became high-altitude wind cutting through torn gloves. Then Shadow moved. The shepherd pressed his full weight against Ethan's legs, hard enough to force him back against the trunk of a pine. Not jumping, not barking, just leaning, solid, familiar. Ethan clenched both hands in Shadow's fur. The dog stayed there, breathing slowly, anchoring him. Ethan shut his eyes. He counted the breaths like the VA counselor had taught him years ago, even though he had hated the sessions and hated needing them more. 1, 2, 3. The helicopter faded. The forest returned. A raven called somewhere above the road. Ethan opened his eyes and found Shadow staring up at him, calm but watchful. "Still pulling me out," Ethan whispered. Shadow's tail moved once. Ethan sank to one knee in the mud and pressed his forehead against the dog's neck. For a moment, he did not care about the cold soaking through his jeans, or the ache in his shoulders, or the shame that always followed the flashbacks like a second wound. He was alive. Shadow had reminded him. Again. They camped that night beside a narrow creek still rimmed with ice. Ethan chose a spot beneath thick pines where the ground was mostly dry, then gathered dead branches for a small fire. He ate the last sandwich he had bought in town and split a piece of jerky with Shadow. The flames crackled low and orange against the blue, dark evening. Beyond the firelight, the wilderness stood close, not threatening, not welcoming either, just present. Ethan sat with his back against a fallen log, his boots steaming near the flames, Shadow curled beside him with his head resting on Ethan's thigh. The old shepherd's eyes reflected the fire in small amber sparks. "You remember Kunar?" Ethan asked quietly. Shadow's ears twitched. "Yeah, I try not to either." Wind moved through the treetops like distant surf. Ethan looked up through the branches at a narrow piece of sky where the first stars were beginning to show. "I don't know what I bought, boy," he said. "Could be a shack full of rats. Could be a roof that caves in the first snow. Could be nothing but another bad decision." Shadow breathed slowly. Ethan rubbed the scarred place behind the dog's left ear. "But maybe that's all right. Maybe nothing is what we need." He looked toward the darkness where the old road continued climbing. "I'm tired, Shadow." The words came out smaller than he intended. He had said that sentence before, but only inside his own head. Never out loud. Never where the world could hear it. "I'm tired of towns. Tired of people watching my hands shake. Tired of pretending loud noises don't put me back over there. Tired of waking up and having nowhere I'm supposed to be." Shadow lifted his head. The dog looked at him with the patient, solemn attention only old dogs and good soldiers seem to possess. Ethan swallowed hard. "That ranger station is probably the last place I get to choose. If it falls apart, then it falls apart. If winter buries us, then we'll deal with that when it comes. But maybe up there, nobody asks questions. Maybe up there, I can stop being a problem someone else has to step around." The fire shifted, sending a brief spray of sparks into the dark. For several minutes, Ethan said nothing. Then Shadow rose suddenly. His body stiffened. His nose pointed toward the road behind them. Ethan's hand moved to the survival knife at his belt before he consciously decided to reach for it. The forest stayed still. No footsteps. No voices. Only creek water moving under thin ice. But Shadow kept staring into the dark. Low growl. Quiet. Controlled. Ethan listened. At first, there was nothing. Then, far down the road behind them, came the faint crack of a branch under weight. Not animal weight. Human. Ethan slowly killed the fire by pushing damp earth over the coals. Smoke curled upward and vanished into the trees. He packed without turning on his headlamp. Old training returned in pieces. Efficient. Silent. Calm in a way he had not felt in years. Shadow stood beside him, facing the darkness. Whatever was back there did not come closer. Or if it did, it moved carefully enough that even Ethan could not hear it. They did not sleep much that night. Before dawn, Ethan shouldered his pack again and continued up the road while the sky was still black between the pines. Shadow walked ahead now, nose low, pausing every few yards as if reading a story written in mud and cold air. The second day was harder. The road ended where a landslide had taken half the mountainside years before. From there, Ethan followed the old foot trail marked on the county map, a faint line climbing toward a pass choked with late snow. The grade became cruel. His lungs burned in the thin air. His thighs shook from the steady rise. At one creek crossing, the log bridge had collapsed. Ethan tested the current with a pole. Too fast. Too deep. He walked upstream until he found a place where boulders broke the water. Shadow crossed first, light and sure despite his age. Ethan followed, stepping from stone to stone with his pack dragging him off balance. Halfway across, his right boot slipped. Ice water swallowed his leg to the knee. He caught himself on both hands against the rock, gasping as cold knifed through him. Shadow barked once from the far bank. Sharp. Commanding. Ethan dragged himself upright and stumbled the rest of the way across, teeth clenched so hard his jaw hurt. On the far side, he sat shivering while Shadow pushed his muzzle under Ethan's hand, refusing to let him drift into the dangerous sleepiness that cold sometimes brings. "Bossy old bastard," Ethan muttered. Shadow licked his wrist. By late afternoon, they reached the pass. It was nothing more than a narrow break between granite shoulders, but the wind there was fierce enough to make Ethan stagger. Snowfields clung to the shaded slopes. Far below, a valley opened like a secret. Dark pines, a long mirror of black water, and somewhere hidden beyond the trees, Black Hollow Ranger Station. Ethan stood at the pass with Shadow beside him and felt the first true pull of the place. Not comfort, not yet, but gravity, as if the mountains had reached out and taken hold of the frayed remains of his life. Shadow stared down into the valley. Then he gave a low sound Ethan had not heard from him since Afghanistan. Not fear, recognition. Ethan looked at the dog. "What do you know that I don't?" Shadow did not look away from the valley. Wind screamed over the pass, tugging at Ethan's jacket, carrying the scent of snow and water and old pine. Far below, beyond the dark lake, something metallic flashed once in the lowering sun. A roof, a tower, a place nobody wanted, a place that had waited. Ethan tightened the straps on his pack and began the descent. The trail dropped sharply from the pass into a valley drowned in shadow and pine. Snowmelt streamed down the rocks in silver ribbons beside the narrow path. The air grew colder with every 100 feet they descended, the kind of mountain cold that never fully leaves the shade even in late spring. Wind whispered through the lodgepole pines in long, slow breaths, carrying the scent of wet bark and distant water. Shadow moved ahead of Ethan without hesitation. Not fast, purposeful, like a dog following something only he could sense. The lower they descended, the quieter the world became. No roads, no aircraft, no distant engines, only boots crunching damp earth and the occasional caw of ravens circling high above the ridgeline. By late afternoon, the trail leveled into a broad basin surrounded by steep granite walls streaked with old snowfields. The sun hung low behind the western ridge, turning the upper peaks gold while the valley floor below remained deep blue with cold shadow. Then Ethan saw the lake. Black Hollow Lake spread beneath the trees like polished obsidian. Still, dark, perfectly silent. Its shoreline curved through dense timber except for one narrow clearing on the northern side where a weathered structure sat half hidden among the pines. Black Hollow Ranger Station. Ethan stopped walking. For several seconds, neither he nor Shadow moved. The station looked exactly like the photograph from the county listing, and somehow nothing like it at all. Pictures had flattened the place, reduced it. The real thing felt alive. The old log structure stood beside the lake beneath towering ponderosa pines, its roof dark green beneath decades of weather and moss. One side of the porch sagged slightly. Several windows were boarded shut. Snow still lingered in patches along the shaded northern wall, and behind the station, rising above the trees like the skeleton of another era, stood the fire lookout tower. Rust climbed the steel braces. The wooden observation cab at the top leaned slightly west, yet it still stood. Watching, waiting. The evening light touched the tower windows for only a moment before slipping behind the mountains. Shadow gave a low sound deep in his throat. Not fear. Recognition again. Ethan felt it too now. Something about the place unsettled him in ways he could not explain. Not danger exactly. More like the strange feeling of walking into a room where someone had just left seconds before you arrived. The station should have looked abandoned. Instead, it looked paused, as if time itself had stopped moving there. "Well," Ethan muttered quietly, "guess this is home." Shadow did not take his eyes off the buildings. They crossed the clearing slowly. Tall grass brushed against Ethan's boots. Meltwater dripped steadily from the eaves of the station roof. Somewhere across the lake, a loon called once, its lonely cry echoing through the basin before fading back into silence. The front porch groaned beneath Ethan's weight as he climbed the steps. He noticed details immediately. Military habit. The padlock on the front door was newer than the county photographs. Not new, but newer. The screws holding one window board in place had fresh scrape marks around them. And near the porch steps, partly hidden beneath pine needles, Ethan found a cigarette butt still dry despite the recent rain. Not old. A week, maybe. 2 at most. His pulse slowed automatically into the calm alertness that had once kept him alive overseas. Someone had been here recently. Shadow sniffed along the porch edge, hackles rising slightly beneath his thick coat. "You smell it too, huh?" The dog gave a soft rumble. Ethan tested the padlock. Rusty, but weak. 3 solid strikes with a rock shattered it loose. The door opened inward with a long groan of swollen wood. Cold air rolled out from inside, carrying the smell of dust, old smoke, wet timber, and something metallic underneath it all. The interior remained dim even with daylight outside. Ethan stood motionless for several seconds, allowing his eyes to adjust. The station consisted of one large central room, with a smaller kitchen area toward the back and a narrow hallway leading deeper inside. Dust covered nearly every surface, but unlike most abandoned places, the building had not been vandalized. Nothing was overturned. Nothing spray-painted. The old furniture still stood where it belonged. A heavy oak desk sat beneath the front windows. A cast-iron wood stove occupied the center of the room. Shelves lined the walls holding weathered binders, glass lanterns, rusted tools, and old Forest Service manuals stacked neatly as if someone expected to use them again someday. Maps covered one wall, hundreds of them. Topographic surveys, fire grids, evacuation routes, some yellowed, nearly brown with age. Ethan walked deeper into the room, boots creaking softly across warped pine floorboards. Shadow entered behind him, then immediately stopped. The dog's entire posture changed. Rigid, focused. His ears lifted sharply toward the rear of the station. Ethan followed the shepherd's stare. At first he saw nothing unusual. Then he noticed the steel hatch, set directly into the floor near the back hallway. Roughly 4 feet wide, industrial gray beneath years of dust. Heavy bolts sealed the edges. Shadow crossed the room quickly and stood over it. Then the shepherd scratched once against the metal. Sharp, deliberate. Ethan frowned. "What is it?" Shadow scratched again, harder this time. The sound echoed strangely through the station. Ethan crouched beside the hatch and wiped dust away with his sleeve. Stenciled letters slowly appeared beneath the grime. U.S. Forest Service utility access authorized personnel only. A thick padlock secured the latch mechanism. Unlike the front door lock, this one looked solid, military grade. Ethan ran his fingers along the cold steel. The hatch wasn't simply locked. It had been sealed. Shadow lowered his nose to the edges and whined softly. That sound bothered Ethan more than barking would have. Shadow almost never whined, not unless something was wrong. Ethan leaned closer. A faint current of colder air drifted upward through the seams around the hatch. The smell carried with it old rust, damp concrete, and something else buried deep beneath decades of dust. Smoke. Very faint, very old. He stood slowly. "We'll worry about that later." Shadow did not move. Ethan finally pulled the dog gently away from the hatch and began clearing space near the wood stove before darkness fully settled outside. The station had no electricity, but Ethan found several oil lanterns hanging beside the shelves. One still contained fuel. By sunset, he had a small fire crackling inside the stove and weak yellow lantern light flickering against the log walls. Outside, the mountains disappeared into darkness, one ridge at a time. The temperature dropped fast after sunset. Cold crept through the station floor and walls despite the fire. Ethan unpacked methodically. sleeping bag, water filter, knife, medical kit, coffee tin. The routine steadied him. For years after leaving the teams, he had survived by reducing life to manageable tasks. Simple motions, clear objectives. Keep moving, keep functioning. Don't think too much. Shadow finally left the hatch long enough to circle twice beside the stove before lying down. But even resting, the dog kept glancing toward the back hallway. Ethan noticed. He noticed everything now. The station groaned occasionally as night cold tightened the old timber. Wind brushed lightly against the roof. Somewhere near the shoreline, water lapped softly against rocks. Then came another sound. 3 dull metallic knocks from beneath the floor. Ethan froze instantly. Shadow exploded upright with a deep growl rolling through the room. Silence followed. Absolute silence. Ethan stared toward the hatch. The lantern flame flickered weakly. Nothing moved. After nearly 30 seconds, Ethan exhaled slowly and forced himself to think rationally. Old pipes, shifting metal, temperature changes. That was all. Had to be. Still, he found himself checking the windows carefully before fully settling in for the night. Most remained intact beneath layers of grime. One window near the kitchen faced directly toward the lookout tower behind the station. From there, Ethan could see the dark silhouette of the observation cab against the moonlit sky. For a moment, he thought he saw movement inside the tower, a shadow crossing one of the upper windows. He narrowed his eyes. Nothing. Only moonlight. Only exhaustion. But the uneasy feeling remained. Later, lying inside his sleeping bag beside the stove while Shadow slept lightly near the door, Ethan listened to the wilderness surrounding Black Hollow. No traffic. No sirens. No televisions through apartment walls. Only mountain silence pressing gently against the station from every side. He should have felt peaceful. Instead, he felt watched. Not by a person exactly, by the place itself. His eyes drifted toward the dark hallway leading to the sealed hatch. Shadow lifted his head again. The old shepherd stared directly into the darkness. Low growl, barely audible. Then, very slowly, Shadow walked back toward the hatch and lay down beside it, like a sentry standing guard. Ethan watched the dog for a long time. "Whatever's down there," he murmured quietly. "You already know about it, don't you?" Shadow rested his head across his paws, but never stopped watching the steel door. Outside, wind moved across Black Hollow Lake beneath the moon, and somewhere high above the station, hidden in the darkness of the old fire tower, something metallic creaked softly once, as though weight had shifted inside the abandoned cab. Ethan did not sleep much that night. Years in the teams had trained him to rest in fragments, short stretches, light enough that the smallest sound could drag him awake instantly. Every groan of old timber inside the station pulled at the edges of his sleep. Every gust of mountain wind brushing the walls sounded like footsteps moving slowly outside, but none of it disturbed him as much as Shadow. The old shepherd never left the basement hatch. Even after the fire burned low and the lantern flickered itself out, Shadow remained stretched across the cold steel door, with his head lifted toward the hallway darkness. Watching. Listening. Sometime near dawn, Ethan finally drifted into a shallow sleep filled with broken dreams of snow-covered ridges and radio static. He saw men climbing through smoke again. Heard distant shouting swallowed by helicopter blades. The same dream that had followed him for nearly 15 years. Then came the barking. Sharp, violent, close. Ethan jerked awake instantly. Shadow stood at the front window snarling toward the clearing outside. The first gray light of morning spilled weakly through the dirty glass. Ethan grabbed the hunting knife beside his sleeping bag and crossed the room barefoot, pulse already hammering. "What is it?" Shadow's growl deepened. Ethan peered carefully through the grime-covered window. At first he saw only trees moving in the morning wind. Then he noticed the tracks. Fresh boot prints in the snow patches beside the porch. Not his. Not old. Someone had walked around the station during the night. The tracks circled once near the woodshed before disappearing back toward the tree line. Ethan opened the door carefully. Cold mountain air rushed inside, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Shadow shot past him immediately, nose low to the ground. Ethan followed the tracks around the cabin slowly. Military instincts returned without effort now. Distance, direction, weight distribution. The prints belonged to a man, heavy boots, tall stride, and whoever it was had stopped outside the side window long enough to stand there watching the station. Ethan crouched beside the deepest print. The edges remained sharp. Less than 6 hours old. Shadow followed the scent trail toward the trees, but stopped abruptly near the edge of the clearing. His ears flattened slightly. A low, uneasy whine escaped his throat. Then the scent simply vanished, as if the person had disappeared into the mountain itself. Ethan stared into the forest for a long moment. The woods stood silent beneath drifting morning fog. No movement. No sound. Still, the back of his neck prickled. He returned inside without speaking. The station suddenly felt different in daylight. Not haunted exactly. Occupied. As though invisible traces of old lives still lingered in the walls. He spent the morning working because work had always been the only reliable cure for thinking too much. The station needed everything. One front window had cracked completely through from years of winter freeze. The rain barrels beside the porch were clogged with pine needles and dead insects. Half the dock posts at the lake had rotted through, causing the narrow platform to sag sideways into the water. Ethan attacked the repairs methodically. Clean, organize, secure shelter. The routine steadied him. By noon, he had cleared most of the debris from the main room and reopened 2 of the windows to let fresh air inside. Dust swirled golden through shafts of sunlight cutting across the floorboards. The smell of old wood smoke slowly gave way to pine and cold mountain air. Shadow shadowed him constantly, never more than a few feet away, except near the basement hatch. Whenever Ethan crossed the rear hallway, the dog stopped whatever he was doing and stared at the sealed steel door with fixed attention. Twice, Ethan caught Shadow growling softly at it again. The second time, he finally crouched beside the hatch and examined it properly. The bolts were badly rusted, but still intact. Someone long ago had welded reinforcement plates around the hinges from the inside, making the door far heavier than a normal utility access hatch should have been. He tapped the steel with his knuckles. Solid. The sound echoed strangely from below. Not shallow. Deep. Whatever lay under Black Hollow Ranger Station extended farther underground than Ethan expected. A faded clipboard hung beside the hatch. Most pages had rotted unreadable, but one sheet remained partly intact beneath layers of dust. Utility tunnel access authorized emergency use only. Tunnel, not basement. Ethan frowned. That made even less sense. Why would a remote ranger station need underground tunnels? Shadow suddenly barked once behind him. Ethan turned sharply. The dog stood rigid at the window facing the lookout tower. Ethan followed his gaze. The tower rose behind the station against the pale afternoon sky, rusted and silent above the trees. Nothing moved there now. Still, Ethan could not shake the feeling that someone had been watching the station from above the night before. By late afternoon, clouds gathered over the western ridges again, dark and swollen with incoming weather. Wind rolled across the lake in long, cold waves, rattling the pine branches around the clearing. Ethan found the woodshed partly collapsed behind the station and spent nearly 2 hours reinforcing it before the storm arrived. Inside, stacked beneath decades of dust, remained enough dry firewood to last weeks. That surprised him. Most abandoned places got stripped clean eventually, but Black Hollow had been left untouched, almost respectfully. Near sunset, Ethan finally explored the back rooms. The narrow hallway led to two smaller chambers beyond the kitchen. One appeared to have served as sleeping quarters long ago. An iron bed frame still stood against the wall beside a rusted lantern and a bookshelf filled with old paperbacks swollen from moisture. The second room had once been an office. Maps covered nearly every wall. Not ordinary hiking maps. Fire behavior charts, evacuation grids, topographic overlays marked with handwritten notes in faded red pencil. And on the desk near the window sat a stack of old ranger journals bound in cracked black leather. Ethan picked up the top volume carefully. Ranger Walter Grady, Black Hollow Station, 1984. The pages smelled faintly of mildew and smoke. He sat beside the dusty window while wind moaned softly outside and began reading. Most entries were ordinary. Weather reports, wildlife sightings, trail conditions, supply inventories. But Walter Grady wrote differently than most government men Ethan had known. There was loneliness in the writing. Not bitter loneliness, observant loneliness. The kind born from spending too much time in wilderness silence. May 11th, 1984. Saw fresh elk sign near the eastern ridge. Snowpack melting faster than expected. No visitors in 12 days. Some mornings the silence out here feels alive enough to answer back if you listen too long. Another entry. June 2nd. Forest Service wants another budget cut. They keep talking about closing stations, like places can stop mattering just because nobody lives near them anymore. Ethan kept reading while daylight slowly faded. Then he found the final entries. August 18th. Smoke visible west of Clearwater drainage. Wind shifting wrong direction. August 20th. Evacuation maps are outdated. Tried radioing county twice. No response. August 21st. Something isn't right. That was the final complete sentence. The remaining pages were blank. Ethan sat very still. Outside, thunder rolled faintly beyond the mountains. Officially, Walter Grady had abandoned Black Hollow during the wildfire evacuation in 1984. Ethan remembered reading that in the county property documents before buying the station. Ranger presumed fled area during emergency conditions, but the journals did not sound like a man preparing to run. They sounded like a man trying desperately to warn someone. Shadow appeared silently in the doorway behind him. The dog looked uneasy again. Ethan rubbed his tired eyes. "You think he stayed?" Shadow stared toward the hallway, toward the hatch. As darkness settled outside, Ethan carried the journals back into the main room and lit the oil lantern again. Rain began striking the roof shortly after nightfall, steady and cold. The storm deepened quickly. Wind howled through the pines around Black Hollow, bending the treetops in slow, violent waves. Rain hammered the station windows hard enough to shake the old glass. Inside, the fire crackled warmly. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something close to calm settling into him. No traffic, no crowded streets, no voices demanding explanations. Just rain, firelight, and the quiet presence of the old dog beside him. He cooked beans and canned stew on the wood stove while Shadow slept near the flames. The station creaked softly around them like an old ship riding heavy water. Ethan caught himself relaxing enough to almost forget the boot prints outside. Almost. Then came the sound, a single sharp crack from deep in the forest beyond the lake. Gunfire. Distant, but unmistakable. Shadow exploded upright immediately. Ethan killed the lantern flame instinctively. Darkness swallowed the station except for faint firelight. Both man and dog listened. Nothing followed. Only rain. Only wind. Still, Ethan moved silently toward the front window and scanned the darkness outside. Then he saw it. Far across the lake near the tree line, a brief flash of light. White. Gone instantly. Like someone covering a flashlight. Shadow growled low beside him. Ethan's heartbeat slowed into that dangerous combat calm again. Someone else was out there, watching Black Hollow through the storm, and whoever it was knew the station was no longer empty. Ethan remained at the window long after the light disappeared across the lake. Rain hammered the station roof in heavy waves. Wind bent the pine trees until their tops scraped against each other with a dry, groaning sound. Beyond the glass, darkness swallowed nearly everything except the pale strip of shoreline illuminated faintly by lightning far out over the mountains. Shadow stood beside him motionless. The shepherd's growl had faded into silence now, but every muscle in his body remained tight. Ethan knew that posture. Target locked, threat not gone, only hidden. He stayed awake most of the night with the hunting knife resting beside his leg and the old lantern turned low. Several times he thought he heard movement outside near the woodshed, but whenever he stepped onto the porch with the flashlight, he found only rain and black forest stretching endlessly beyond the clearing. By morning, the storm had passed. Cold sunlight spilled through the pines, turning the wet ground silver. Mist drifted low across Black Hollow Lake in thin, ghost-like ribbons. Snow still clung to the upper slopes above the valley, glowing white against dark granite. The station looked peaceful again. Too peaceful. Ethan checked the clearing carefully after sunrise. Fresh tracks circled near the tree line. Not animal tracks. Boots again. The same heavy tread from before. Whoever had been watching the station had stayed there during the storm. Watching. Waiting. The tracks eventually disappeared toward the southern trail leading out of the valley, toward Elk River. Ethan crouched beside them for a long moment. Then he stood and looked back at the station. The supply situation was becoming a problem anyway. He needed fuel, canned food, batteries, and proper tools if he planned on staying through the summer. The nearest town sat nearly 40 miles away by the old logging route. If someone out there knew about Black Hollow, Ethan needed answers before the mountains closed in around him completely. "Looks like we're making a town run," he said quietly. Shadow gave a single wag of his tail. The hike out took most of the day. Morning fog burned away slowly as Ethan and Shadow followed the old service trail south through thick timber and narrow valleys where snowmelt creeks rushed loud beneath fallen logs. Ravens circled overhead from time to time, their shadows gliding silently across the trail ahead. The farther they moved from Black Hollow, the more Ethan felt civilization returning in fragments. Old fence posts, a washed-out road marker, rusting beer cans half buried beneath pine needles. Human traces. By late afternoon, they reached Elk River. The town looked exactly like the kind of place forgotten by time and highways alike. One gas station, one grocery store, a post office no larger than a hunting cabin. Most of the buildings stood beneath faded signs and peeling paint weathered pale by decades of mountain winters. Pickup trucks lined the muddy main street. Smoke drifted lazily from chimneys into the cold blue sky. People noticed Ethan immediately. Not openly. Mountain towns rarely stared, but strangers got measured quietly there. Especially broken-looking ones with military dogs. Shadow stayed close beside Ethan's leg as they walked down the main street. The shepherd's eyes moved constantly, reading doorways, parked vehicles, movement patterns. Still working. Even old soldiers never fully stop. The diner sat at the far end of town beneath a faded red sign that read, "Martha's Kitchen, warm air smelling of coffee, bacon grease, and fresh bread," rolled over Ethan as he stepped inside. Conversations softened briefly. Forks paused. Then life resumed. The diner held maybe 15 people total. Loggers, hunters, older couples drinking coffee by the windows. A waitress carrying pie slices between tables. Behind the counter stood a woman somewhere in her 60s with silver hair tied back beneath a blue bandana. She looked directly at Ethan, then at Shadow. Her expression changed almost instantly. Recognition. Not of him specifically. Of damage. People who had lived long enough learned to recognize certain kinds of pain without needing explanations. "You boys look frozen," she said gently. "Sit wherever you want." Ethan chose a booth near the back wall where he could see both entrances automatically, without thinking about it. Old habits. Shadow settled beneath the table. The waitress brought coffee without asking. Real coffee. Hot and strong enough to smell from inches away. Ethan wrapped both hands around the mug for a moment before drinking. The warmth hurt his fingers. Martha returned carrying a plate stacked with eggs, hash browns, toast, and bacon. "I didn't order. You looked hungry anyway." Ethan hesitated. "I don't have much cash." She shrugged. "Then pay next time." Something tightened unexpectedly in Ethan's chest. Kindness had become difficult for him to receive. Harder sometimes than anger. "Thank you," he said quietly. Martha nodded once and lowered her voice slightly. "Army?" "Navy." "Thought so." "How?" "My husband came home from Vietnam carrying that same look around in his eyes." She glanced briefly toward Shadow beneath the table. "And dogs like yours don't belong to ordinary people." Ethan looked down at the shepherd. Shadow rested calmly now, though his ears still tracked every sound inside the diner. "He kept me alive more times than I kept him alive," Ethan said. Martha smiled sadly. "Usually how it works." For the first time in days, Ethan felt his shoulders loosen slightly. Outside the diner windows, afternoon sunlight glowed against muddy streets and old pickup trucks. Elk River looked worn down, but honest. The kind of town where people minded their business because they all carried ghosts of their own. Then the bell above the diner door rang. Conversation inside shifted subtly. A deputy entered wearing a tan county jacket and mud-stained boots. Tall, broad-shouldered, late 40s maybe. His expression hardened immediately when he noticed Ethan. The deputy approached slowly, thumbs hooked through his belt. "That your shepherd outside the station road yesterday?" Ethan met his gaze evenly. "Depends who's asking." "Deputy Ron Kessler." No handshake offered. Kessler glanced briefly toward Shadow, who now watched him without blinking. "You staying up at Black Hollow?" "Bought it." Several men inside the diner exchanged quiet looks. Kessler's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "That place should have stayed empty." Ethan sipped his coffee. "County sold it." "County sells lots of things they shouldn't." Martha stepped closer behind the counter. "Ron." The deputy ignored her. "You military?" "Used to be." "Well, used to be or not, you ought to know some places are abandoned for reasons." Ethan's voice remained calm. "What reasons?" Kessler studied him for several seconds before answering. "Wildfires, landslides, bad terrain." "That all?" The deputy leaned slightly closer. "You hear stories about Black Hollow, don't go chasing them. Mountains are full of old rumors." Shadow gave a low, warning growl beneath the table. Kessler looked down at the dog. The deputy's expression changed again. Not fear, discomfort. Like Shadow recognized something unpleasant before Ethan did. Then another voice interrupted from the far end of the counter. "He deserves the truth more than rumors." Everyone turned. An old man sat alone near the pie case wearing suspenders and a faded smoke jumper jacket patched at the elbows. His weathered face carried the deep lines of someone who had spent most of life outdoors. Eli Turner. Even Ethan recognized the type immediately. Firefighter. Old-school wilderness man. Eli rose slowly and carried his coffee to Ethan's booth without waiting for permission. Kessler muttered something under his breath and walked toward the door. Before leaving, he stopped beside Ethan one final time. "Black Hollow ain't empty," he said quietly. "And some things buried in those mountains should stay buried." Then he left. Silence lingered after the door shut behind him. Eli sipped his coffee. "Ron talks tough when he's nervous." Ethan studied the old man carefully. "You worked out there?" "Long time ago." Eli's eyes drifted toward the mountains visible beyond town. "Before they shut the station down." He lowered his voice. "Walter Grady was a friend of mine." Ethan felt the name settle heavily between them. "The Ranger." Eli nodded once. "Best wilderness man I ever knew. Stayed up there year-round most years. Knew every trail, every drainage, every storm pattern." He paused. "County said he abandoned his post during the fire back in '84. You don't believe that?" "Walter would have died before running." The old firefighter stared into his coffee for several seconds. "Truth is, Walter was trying to warn people before he disappeared. Said evacuation routes were wrong. Said crews were heading straight into the burn path." Eli's voice hardened slightly. "Nobody listened." Martha approached quietly and refilled Eli's cup. The old man continued. "Few days later, fire blew through the valley. Station went silent." He looked directly at Ethan now. "Afterward, County blamed Walter, claimed he panicked and ran." Eli shook his head slowly. "Never sat right with me." Outside, wind rattled the diner windows softly. Ethan thought about the journals, the unfinished entries. Something isn't right. "Some secrets outlive the men who buried them," Eli said quietly. Shadow suddenly rose beneath the table. Every hair along the dog's shoulders lifted. Ethan turned instantly toward the front window. A man stood near Ethan's truck outside across the muddy street. Tall, dark jacket, ball cap pulled low. The stranger appeared to be looking inside the cab. Then Shadow exploded toward the door. The shepherd hit it so hard, the bell above the frame clanged violently. Ethan barely caught up as Shadow burst outside into the street snarling. The stranger spun once. For half a second, Ethan saw only sharp features and pale eyes beneath the cap. Then the man ran. Shadow chased him between parked trucks with terrifying speed for an aging dog. The stranger vaulted a roadside barrier and disappeared into a narrow alley beside the feed store. By the time Ethan reached the alley entrance, both man and dog had vanished around the far corner. "Shadow!" His voice echoed through the empty lane, then came barking farther ahead. Ethan ran hard despite the pain stabbing through his knees. He rounded the corner and found Shadow standing alone near the tree line beyond town, growling toward the forest. The stranger was gone. Only fresh boot prints remained in the mud leading into the woods. The same tread pattern Ethan had seen outside Black Hollow. Shadow kept staring into the trees long after the man disappeared. Ethan slowly crouched beside him. "Yeah," he whispered. Someone else knew about the station. And now they knew Ethan was asking questions. The hike back to Black Hollow felt different. Not because the mountains had changed, because Ethan had. The wilderness no longer felt empty. Every ridgeline looked capable of hiding eyes. Every snapped twig behind him pulled instinct tight through his chest. Even the silence carried weight now. Shadow sensed it too. The shepherd ranged farther ahead than usual, stopping often to look back toward Ethan before continuing along the narrow trail through the pines. His ears never stopped moving, watching, listening, working. By the time they reached the upper basin above Black Hollow Lake, heavy clouds had swallowed the western sky again. Wind rushed low across the ridges, carrying the sharp metallic scent of incoming snow, even though spring had barely settled into the valley below. Ethan paused near the final overlook. Far beneath him, Black Hollow Ranger Station sat alone beside the dark water exactly where he had left it. But something immediately felt wrong. The front door stood partially open. Ethan dropped instinctively into a crouch. Shadow stiffened beside him with a low growl. From half a mile away, Ethan studied the clearing through narrowed eyes. No visible movement. No smoke. No vehicles. Still, the open door sent cold unease sliding through him. He had locked it before leaving. They descended quickly. The wind strengthened as they crossed the final stretch through the trees. Pine branches swayed violently overhead now, creaking like old ships in rough water. When Ethan finally reached the clearing, he moved silently toward the station wall and listened first. Nothing inside. Only wind. The front door hung crooked on one hinge, forced open. Ethan stepped inside slowly with Shadow close against his leg. The main room looked untouched at first glance. Then he noticed the details. The journals from Walter Grady's office lay scattered across the floorboards. The map wall had been searched, drawers ripped open, the shelves near the stove emptied. But nothing valuable was missing. Whoever entered the station had not come looking for supplies. They had come searching for something specific. Shadow crossed the room immediately and stopped at the basement hatch, growling. The steel door remained sealed, but fresh scrape marks scarred the edges near the bolts. Someone had tried to force it open. Ethan crouched beside the hatch. A deep scratch cut through the rust beside the locking mechanism, bright silver beneath years of corrosion. Recent. Very recent. The stranger from Elk River had come here, and whatever he wanted was beneath the station. Thunder rolled across the valley, this time much closer. Ethan rose slowly and looked toward the windows. The sky above Black Hollow had turned nearly black. Wind drove needles of cold rain sideways through the clearing. The storm was arriving fast. By nightfall, it had become the worst mountain storm Ethan had seen in years. Rain hammered the station roof so hard, conversation would have been impossible if anyone else had been there. Wind screamed down from the granite ridges above the lake, shaking the entire structure in violent bursts. Branches snapped in the forest outside with loud cracking reports that echoed through the darkness. Snow mixed into the rain shortly after midnight. Wet, heavy, relentless. The temperature dropped sharply. Ethan fed more wood into the stove and reinforced the broken front door with furniture, while Shadow paced restlessly between the windows and the basement hatch. The dog refused to settle. Every few minutes he returned to the steel door, scratching hard against it. Enough, Ethan muttered finally. Shadow barked sharply back at him. Not disobedient, urgent. Another violent gust slammed against the station walls. Then came the sound. A low metallic groan from beneath the floor. Ethan froze. The hatch vibrated once beneath Shadow's paws. Another groan followed. Not from the storm. From deep underground. Shadow barked furiously now, scratching at the hatch with both front paws. Ethan stared at the steel bolts, then toward the windows where snow whipped sideways through darkness so thick the outside world barely existed anymore. Whatever answers Black Hollow held, they were beneath his feet, and the storm had trapped them there anyway. Fine, he said quietly. He grabbed the pry bar from his pack. The bolts fought him hard. Years of rust fused the steel nearly solid. Ethan worked by lantern light while the storm battered the station around him. Muscles burned across his shoulders and back as he leaned his full weight against the bar again and again. The first bolt finally snapped loose with a loud metallic crack. Shadow immediately lowered his nose toward the opening seam. Cold air breathed upward from below. Not ordinary basement cold. Deep earth cold. The smell rising from beneath the hatch carried damp concrete, rusted metal, stale fuel, and smoke. Old smoke. Ethan's pulse slowed into sharp focus. The second bolt gave way. Then the third. Finally, with one last violent pull, the hatch shifted upward several inches. A burst of freezing air rushed into the room hard enough to extinguish the lantern flame instantly. Darkness swallowed the station. For several seconds, Ethan heard nothing except wind roaring outside and Shadow growling low beside the opening. Then lightning flashed through the windows. In that brief white light, Ethan saw stairs descending into blackness beneath the station. Concrete stairs. Industrial. Not what belonged under a simple ranger cabin. He relit the lantern slowly. The yellow glow spilled downward, revealing narrow concrete walls disappearing into the earth. "Stay close," he whispered. Shadow descended first. The stairs led nearly 20 feet underground, before opening into a narrow tunnel lined with rusted utility pipes and ancient electrical conduit. Water dripped steadily somewhere deeper inside. Emergency bulbs hung dead from the ceiling behind metal cages thick with dust. Cold War infrastructure. Ethan recognized it immediately. The federal government had built hidden emergency networks across remote wilderness areas during the 60s. Backup communication routes, fuel storage, survival bunkers. But why beneath Black Hollow? Their footsteps echoed softly as they moved deeper underground. Shadow suddenly stopped. The dog's body went rigid. Then he whimpered. Ethan lifted the lantern higher. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber, partially collapsed beneath fallen concrete and rotting beams. Old filing cabinets lined one wall beside stacks of rusted fuel drums marked U.S. government property. Military radio equipment sat beneath tarps thick with dust. And near the collapsed wall, bones. Human bones, partially buried beneath concrete debris. Ethan stopped breathing for a moment. The skeleton rested on its side near a broken radio console. Torn fragments of faded Forest Service uniform still clung to the remains beneath decades of dust and collapse. Shadow approached slowly. The old shepherd lowered himself beside the body and let out a soft, mournful sound Ethan had never heard before. Not fear, grief. Ethan crouched carefully beside the remains. A rusted nameplate still hung from the torn uniform shirt. Walter Grady. For several seconds, the storm above disappeared completely. No wind, no thunder. Only silence deep beneath Black Hollow. Walter Grady never abandoned the station. He died here. Ethan stared at the collapsed tunnel around the skeleton. Part of the ceiling had clearly caved inward years ago. Fresh scorch marks blackened the walls nearby. Melted wiring hung from the ceiling like burned vines. Fire damage, smoke damage. Walter must have become trapped underground during the wildfire, trying to use the emergency radios, trying to warn someone. The realization settled heavily inside Ethan's chest. All those years, all those rumors. The county had blamed a dead man for running. Shadow rested quietly beside Walter's remains, eyes fixed on the skeleton with strange, solemn calm. Then the dog lifted his head sharply toward the far end of the chamber, growling again. Ethan turned. At first he saw only darkness beyond the collapsed beams, then lightning flashed faintly through a distant ventilation shaft high above the tunnel. For one brief second, Ethan saw another door deeper underground. Heavy steel, partially open, and just beyond it, something metallic reflecting the lantern light. Equipment. More rooms. More secrets. Another thunderclap shook the station overhead hard enough to send dust raining from the ceiling. The storm outside intensified into full mountain fury, but Ethan barely noticed anymore, because buried beneath Black Hollow Ranger Station, beside the bones of a forgotten ranger, he had just uncovered the first proof that someone had lied about what happened in 1984. And somewhere deeper beneath the mountain, more truth was waiting. The storm raged overhead for 2 more days. Rain turned to wet snow by morning, then back to freezing rain by nightfall. Wind slammed the ranger station hard enough to shake dust loose from the rafters. The valley beyond the windows vanished completely beneath swirling gray weather and fog thick as smoke. But underground, beneath Black Hollow, The air remained cold and still. Ethan spent the first hours after discovering Walter Grady's remains in silence. Some discoveries changed the shape of a place forever. This was one of them. The dead ranger remained where he had fallen beside the shattered radio equipment. One skeletal hand stretched toward the overturned console, as though he had still been trying to transmit a warning when the tunnel collapsed around him. Shadow never strayed far from the body. The old shepherd moved quietly through the underground chamber now, ears alert, nails clicking softly against concrete floors, while Ethan searched deeper into the hidden facility, with lantern light trembling across the walls. The farther he explored, the stranger Black Hollow became. The tunnel system extended much farther than any emergency shelter should have. Heavy steel doors separated different sections underground. Some stood open. Others remained sealed tight with rusted locking wheels and faded government markings. Inside one chamber, Ethan found shelves stacked with emergency ration tins decades expired. Another room held military communication crates stamped Defense Civil Preparedness Agency, Cold War survival infrastructure. Buried beneath a remote ranger station nobody remembered. None of it made sense. But Walter Grady had known about it. And somebody else clearly knew too. Ethan kept thinking about the intruder. The searched journals. The attempted break-in at the hatch. Someone had come looking for whatever remained hidden underground. That meant Walter's death had never fully disappeared. It had simply been buried. Near midnight on the second storm day, Ethan found the generator room. The chamber sat behind a partially collapsed maintenance corridor deeper beneath the station. Old diesel tanks lined the walls beside rusted electrical panels and backup batteries thick with corrosion. The generator itself looked ancient but intact, military grade, built to survive disaster. Ethan knelt beside the machine and ran his fingers across the housing automatically. Years of field deployments had taught him how to coax life from dying equipment, using little more than patience and stubbornness. "Let's see what you've got left," he muttered. The fuel lines remained dry, but not empty. He spent nearly an hour cleaning sediment from the intake valves and checking connections while Shadow patrolled the tunnel entrance behind him. Finally, Ethan pulled the ignition lever. Nothing. Again. Still nothing. On the fourth attempt, the engine coughed violently, then roared awake. The sound thundered through the underground chambers like a waking beast. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Lights flickered once overhead, twice. Then dim yellow emergency bulbs blinked alive throughout the tunnel system for the first time in 40 years. Ethan shielded his eyes briefly. The underground facility emerged slowly from darkness around him. Concrete walls stained by smoke, old wiring, maps pinned beneath cracked plastic covers, and farther down the tunnel, near the far steel door, a small office. Its light glowed weakly beneath the flickering bulbs. Shadow barked once sharply. Ethan grabbed the lantern and moved carefully toward the room. The office door stood half open. Inside sat a metal desk covered in dust and collapsed papers. Filing cabinets lined the walls. A reel-to-reel tape recorder occupied one shelf beside stacks of magnetic recording tapes sealed inside waterproof military containers. Ethan froze. Walter Grady had left records. Real records. He crossed the room slowly and picked up the nearest tape. Property of U.S. Forest Service Black Hollow Station logs, August 1984. His pulse quickened. The tape recorder looked damaged but repairable. Ethan spent nearly another hour cleaning dust from the mechanisms and reconnecting loose wiring beneath the housing while the storm continued hammering the world above them. Finally, sometime near dawn, he fed the first tape through the reels. The machine clicked softly. Static hissed through the small speaker. Then a man's voice filled the underground office. Calm, tired, very alive. Station log, Walter Grady, August 18th, 1984. Smoke conditions worsening west of Clearwater Basin. wind patterns shifting faster than county projections. Ethan sat motionless. Shadow lay beside the desk, listening quietly. Walter continued. I've radioed county emergency management twice requesting updated evacuation routes. No response yet. The tape crackled. Then silence. Ethan loaded the next reel. More static. Walter's voice again. This time strained. August 19th. Fire jumped containment lines sometime after midnight. If they send crews down the southern drainage using the current maps, they're gonna walk straight into a chimney burn. Papers rustled on the recording. Then another voice faintly through radio static. Unclear. Walter answered sharply. No, listen to me. Listen. Those maps are wrong. The transmission dissolved into noise. Ethan glanced toward Shadow. The old shepherd stared at the tape machine with eerie stillness, ears tilted forward as if understanding every word. Another tape. Another entry. Walter sounded exhausted now. August 20th. County still refusing full evacuation order. They're worried about tourism revenue and liability claims if they shut down the access highways too early. Ethan felt anger tightening slowly through his chest. Walter coughed heavily. There's families camping in the basin below the western ridge. If the fire turns with the wind... The ranger paused. Jesus Christ! The recording ended abruptly. Outside the underground office, thunder rolled faintly through the mountain. Ethan loaded the final tape carefully. The reel spun, long static. Then alarms somewhere in the background. Walter's breathing sounded ragged now, smoke-filled. August 21st. Heavy coughing interrupted him. Fire crossed the southern break faster than predicted. County ordered full retreat 30 minutes ago. Metal crashed somewhere distant on the tape. Walter kept speaking anyway. I stayed behind to reroute the warning signals. There's still crews trapped near Clearwater drainage. More coughing. Then Walter's voice lowered. Not frightened. Resolved. If anybody finds this... He stopped to breathe. Tell them I stayed. Static swallowed the final words. Then came a violent crashing sound. The tape cut off. Silence filled the underground office. Only the low hum of the restored generator remained. Ethan stared at the recorder without moving. His jaw tightened hard enough to ache. The county had blamed Walter Grady for 40 years, called him a coward, a deserter. But the recordings proved the opposite. Walter died trying to save people while officials ignored his warnings. Shadow rose slowly and crossed the room. The old shepherd rested beside Ethan's chair, pressing against his leg exactly the way he always had after difficult missions overseas, grounding him, steadying him. Ethan reached down absently and buried one hand deep in the dog's fur. For several seconds, he could not speak, because Walter's voice sounded too familiar. Not the words, the exhaustion beneath them, the lonely responsibility, the terrible feeling of watching disaster approach while nobody listened. Ethan had heard that tone before. In Afghanistan. In mountain valleys where bad decisions made far away got good men killed. He remembered radioing command once during a snowstorm after spotting movement along a ridgeline his team had been ordered to cross. Possible ambush positions. Request alternate route. Denied. 2 men died 3 hours later beneath machine gun fire exactly where Ethan warned they would. The memory hit him hard enough to steal his breath for a moment. Shadow lifted his head immediately. Ethan closed his eyes. Yeah, he whispered softly. I know. The dog remained pressed against him until the tremor passed. When Ethan finally opened his eyes again, he looked toward the office wall where old evacuation maps still hung beneath dusty plastic. One route had been circled repeatedly in red marker. Clearwater drainage. Walter had known exactly where the fire would go, and somebody had buried the truth. Ethan stood slowly. Anger settled inside him now. Cold, controlled, the dangerous kind. He copied every tape carefully into his backpack along with Walter's journals and several surviving maps from the office. Proof. Real proof. The storm outside finally began weakening near evening. Snow still drifted across the windows upstairs, but the wind had eased enough that the station no longer shook beneath every gust. Ethan climbed back into the main room carrying the tapes while Shadow followed close behind. The station felt different now, not haunted anymore. Witnessed. Walter Grady was no longer just a ghost story whispered in diners. He was a man. A man who stayed. Ethan built a fire in the stove and sat quietly beside it, while darkness settled over Black Hollow once again. Snow drifted softly across the lake beyond the windows. The lookout tower rose black against the storm clouds above the trees. Shadow finally rested near the fire for the first time in days. But even now, every so often, the old shepherd glanced toward the front windows. Watching. Listening. Ethan understood why. Because somebody else knew about these recordings. Somebody had tried to reach them first. And once the storm cleared, whoever had been watching Black Hollow would likely come back. This time prepared. Ethan stared into the firelight, while Walter Grady's final words echoed quietly through his mind. Tell them I stayed. The flames cracked softly inside the stove. Outside, hidden somewhere beyond the frozen lake and dark pine forest, another pair of eyes watched the faint glow of lantern light inside Black Hollow Ranger Station, waiting for the storm to end. Morning arrived gray and bitter cold. The storm had passed during the night, leaving the valley buried beneath fresh snow that glittered pale blue beneath a weak mountain sunrise. Smoke rose steadily from the ranger station chimney into perfectly still air. The world looked clean again. Too clean. Ethan stepped onto the porch holding a cup of black coffee while Shadow moved slowly through the clearing, inspecting the snow. The shepherd stopped near the tree line almost immediately. Fresh tracks. Ethan crossed the clearing carefully. One man, heavy boots. He had stood there recently, watching the station. Watching Ethan, the tracks disappeared back into the forest toward the southern trail before vanishing beneath drifting snow. Shadow sniffed the ground once more and gave a low growl. Yeah, Ethan muttered quietly. He's coming back. The realization no longer frightened him. It angered him. Walter Grady died trying to tell the truth, and 40 years later somebody still cared enough to protect the lie. Ethan spent the morning preparing. The old instincts returned naturally now, waking piece by piece beneath the surface exhaustion he had carried for years. He repaired the front door properly, using timber from the collapsed woodshed. He reinforced the window boards with salvaged nails and cleared sightlines around the station by cutting away thick brush near the clearing edge. Shadow followed him constantly, watching the forest, watching the lake, watching the tower. Every so often the shepherd paused and stared toward the ridgeline above Black Hollow, as though sensing movement Ethan still could not see. By afternoon, Ethan packed Walter's tapes, journals, and copied maps carefully into waterproof bags. The truth needed witnesses, which meant returning to Elk River. The hike south felt heavier this time. Not physically, morally. Every mile through the wilderness seemed burdened by Walter Grady's final words echoing through Ethan's thoughts. Tell them I stayed. The old ranger had died underground, trying to save people while officials protected themselves. Ethan understood that kind of betrayal too well. Years earlier, after the ambush in Afghanistan that killed 2 men from his unit, Ethan spent months replaying the same question in his head. What happens when the people responsible for protecting lives decide protecting themselves matters more? That question had hollowed him out slowly after the war, and now, somehow, it had led him here. By late afternoon, Elk River appeared again, through the trees beneath drifting smoke and low clouds. Snowmelt turned the muddy roads into brown slush. Pickup trucks crawled slowly down Main Street, while townspeople shoveled sidewalks beneath the fading light. Martha's kitchen glowed warmly near the end of town. Inside, the smell of fresh chili and coffee wrapped around Ethan the moment he entered. The diner had filled with locals escaping the cold. Conversation softened briefly when he walked in with Shadow beside him. Martha spotted him immediately. "You look like hell," she said gently. "Been a long couple days." She poured coffee before he even sat down. Eli Turner occupied the same stool near the pie case, smoke jumper jacket draped over his shoulders. The old firefighter studied Ethan's expression carefully. "You found something." Ethan glanced around the diner. Too many ears. "Need someplace quieter." 30 minutes later, they sat together inside the diner storeroom behind the kitchen while snow tapped softly against the rear windows. Martha locked the back door herself before joining them at the small metal table. Ethan laid the tapes down carefully. Neither Eli nor Martha spoke for several seconds. Finally, Eli whispered, "Lord." "He never ran," Ethan said. The old firefighter closed his eyes briefly. "I knew it." Ethan told them everything. The underground tunnels, Walter's remains, the recordings, the evacuation maps, the county warnings ignored during the wildfire. By the time he finished, silence filled the storeroom heavily enough to feel physical. Martha sat slowly in one of the folding chairs. "They blamed him all these years," she said quietly. Eli's weathered hands trembled slightly around his coffee cup. "Walter tried calling us the night before the fire crossed the ridge." His voice sounded distant now, dragged backward through memory. "County command shut the radios down after midnight. Said panic would spread if word got out too early." Ethan looked at him sharply. "You were there?" Eli nodded once. "Lost 3 men in that fire." He stared down at the tapes. "Because those maps were wrong." The old firefighter's eyes glistened briefly in the dim light. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then the storeroom door burst open. Deputy Ron Kessler stepped inside. 2 other deputies followed behind him. Martha rose immediately. "Ron, what the hell? You mind explaining why a homeless drifter's spreading accusations against dead county officials?" Kessler's voice came cold and hard. Shadow stood instantly beside Ethan's chair, growling. The deputy eyed the shepherd carefully, but continued. "You been digging around Black Hollow?" Ethan remained seated. "Depends who's asking." Kessler's jaw tightened. "You're trespassing in a restricted county structure. I own the property. You own the cabin, not federal tunnels beneath it." Ethan watched him carefully now. That detail had never been public. "How'd you know about the tunnels?" The room went silent. Kessler realized the mistake a second too late. Ethan leaned back slowly. "There it is." The deputy's expression darkened. "You don't know what you're stepping into." "Then explain it." Kessler glanced toward Eli. The old firefighter held his gaze without blinking. Finally, the deputy exhaled sharply. "My father was county emergency coordinator during the fire." Ethan said nothing. Kessler continued reluctantly. "The evacuation mistake wasn't supposed to happen. Maps got updated late. Communications broke down. Walter kept pushing warnings through channels nobody wanted reopened. And county officials panicked." Kessler looked away briefly. Tourist season was still active, campgrounds full, businesses threatened lawsuits if highways closed early. Martha stared at him in disbelief. "So, they buried it?" "No," Kessler snapped. "They contained it. By blaming a dead man?" The deputy slammed one hand against the metal table hard enough to rattle the tapes. "You think this town survives if people find out county leadership got firefighters killed?" Ethan's voice stayed low. "The truth survives." Kessler looked at him with naked anger now. "You military guys always think truth fixes everything." His eyes hardened. Sometimes truth just burns everything down. Shadow growled louder. One of the deputies shifted uneasily toward the door. Then Kessler saw the tapes. His expression changed instantly. "Give me those." Ethan stood. "No." The room tightened. For one dangerous second, nobody moved. Then Kessler stepped closer. Ethan's body reacted before thought. Old instincts. Weight balanced. Distance measured. Threat assessed. The deputy saw it happen too. Saw the combat readiness settle into Ethan's posture like something waking beneath old scars. Kessler stopped moving. Shadow positioned himself silently between them. Ears flat. Teeth visible. Martha finally spoke. "Ron, don't." The deputy stared at Ethan several seconds longer, then slowly backed away. "This ends badly for you," he said quietly. "No," Ethan answered. "It ends badly for the men who buried Walter Grady." Kessler left without another word. The storeroom remained silent after the door slammed shut behind him. Eli shook his head slowly. "They're scared. They should be." Outside, evening settled over Elk River beneath low storm clouds returning from the west. Ethan decided to leave immediately. The tapes no longer felt safe in town. Martha packed extra food supplies without charging him, while Eli quietly handed Ethan an old revolver wrapped in cloth. "Used it during wildfire patrol years ago," the old firefighter said. "Haven't touched it since." He looked toward Shadow. "But I got a feeling you boys may need it more than me." Ethan accepted it silently. By the time he and Shadow reached Black Hollow again, night had swallowed the mountains whole. The station sat dark beside the frozen lake beneath blowing snow. Everything looked untouched. Until Ethan saw the woodshed. Smoke curled upward through the darkness. His pulse dropped instantly into combat calm. The woodshed was burning, not fully engulfed yet, but flames crawled through the dry timber walls while sparks drifted upward into the night wind. "Shadow!" The shepherd bolted ahead. Ethan ran hard through the snow toward the station. Then movement exploded from the darkness beside the porch. A man rushed him from behind the woodpile. Fast, heavy. Ethan barely turned in time before the impact slammed both men into the snow. The attacker swung wildly. Ethan blocked instinctively and drove an elbow hard into the man's ribs. Pain flared through Ethan's shoulder from old injuries, but training took over completely now. The stranger recovered fast, military fast. A flashlight beam spun crazily through the darkness as the two men grappled beside the burning shed. Then Shadow hit him. The shepherd launched through the snow with terrifying force for an aging dog, crashing into the attacker's chest hard enough to send both tumbling sideways. The man screamed, not from panic, from surprise. Shadow clamped onto the heavy jacket sleeve and dragged violently backward while growling deep enough to sound almost feral. Ethan surged forward and drove the attacker against the woodshed wall. For one brief second, firelight illuminated the man's face clearly. The stranger from Elk River. Pale eyes, sharp jaw, older than Ethan first thought. Late 50s, maybe. Then the man slammed something hard into Ethan's ribs. Pain exploded through his side. Knife handle, not the blade. A distraction. Before Ethan recovered, the attacker ripped free from Shadow's grip and sprinted toward the trees. Shadow chased several yards before Ethan shouted him back. The old shepherd returned limping slightly, but still alert. Ethan dropped to one knee beside him immediately. "You hit?" Shadow shook snow from his coat and stood steady despite the limp. "Good." The woodshed fire crackled louder behind them now. Ethan grabbed snow with both hands, throwing it on onto the lower flames, while Shadow barked furiously toward the dark forest where the attacker vanished. Eventually, the fire died, but half the woodshed had burned black. The message was clear. Someone wanted the truth buried again, and now they were willing to kill for it. The smell of burned pine lingered over Black Hollow through the rest of the night. Ethan sat awake beside the wood stove with the revolver Eli had given him resting across his knee while Shadow slept near the front door, one paw twitching occasionally in uneasy dreams. Outside, snow drifted silently through the clearing, settling over the blackened remains of the woodshed. The attack had changed something inside Ethan. Not fear, clarity. The man who came to Black Hollow had not acted like a drunk local or a scavenger wandering too far into the mountains. He moved with discipline, purpose, experience, and he had gone straight for the station, straight for the truth. Ethan stared into the firelight, while Walter Grady's tapes rested beside him on the table wrapped carefully in canvas. For years, Ethan had drifted through life like a man already half gone, one temporary job after another, one bus station after another, existing instead of living. But sometime between finding Walter underground and fighting beside the burning woodshed, something buried deep inside him had awakened again. Mission focus, the dangerous calm, the refusal to back down once the line had been crossed. Shadow lifted his head suddenly near dawn, ears rigid. Ethan immediately stood. Then he heard it too. A low crackling sound somewhere beyond the western ridge. Not branches. Fire. He stepped onto the porch into cold gray morning light. At first he saw only clouds moving low through the mountains. Then the wind shifted. Smoke rolled across the ridge in a dark, spreading column. Ethan's stomach tightened instantly. The storm lightning from 2 nights earlier must have struck somewhere west of the basin. The snow had slowed it temporarily, but now the wind was rising again, and the forest was waking dry beneath the surface. Shadow growled softly beside him. Ethan watched the smoke for another moment. Then he moved fast. By noon, the fire had grown visible from Black Hollow. Orange flashes flickered between distant trees high along the western slope. Smoke thickened steadily across the valley, turning sunlight strange and copper-colored. Ash drifted occasionally through the clearing like black snow. Ethan climbed the old lookout tower shortly after midday. The steel structure groaned beneath his weight, rust flaking loose into the wind as he ascended toward the observation cab above the trees. Shadow paced anxiously below the tower the entire time, barking once when Ethan disappeared too long inside the fog of smoke higher up. The cab at the top smelled of dust, bird nests, and old weathered wood. But the view stopped Ethan cold. The western ridge burned. A long line of smoke pushed through the forest exactly where Walter Grady's old maps showed the historical fire corridor from 1984. And worse. The wind was turning south, toward the lake basin, toward the campgrounds beyond Clearwater drainage. Exactly like Walter warned. Ethan spread the old evacuation map across the dusty observation table and compared it against the smoke movement below. The county routes were still wrong. 40 years later, they were still wrong. If hikers or campers were trapped near the southern basin, the main evacuation trail would drive them directly into the fire path once the wind fully shifted. Walter had died trying to stop this exact disaster. "Jesus Christ," Ethan whispered. Then he saw it. Tiny movement far below near the eastern shoreline. 2 small figures. Children. Ethan grabbed the binoculars hanging beside the observation window and focused hard. 2 kids, maybe 10 or 11 years old, alone, moving slowly near the lower trail. No adults visible anywhere nearby. A second later, the wind shifted violently. Smoke rolled downward into the basin like a living thing. The children disappeared completely. Ethan moved instantly. He nearly fell descending the tower ladder in his rush. "Shadow!" The shepherd bounded toward him immediately. "We've got people down there." Within minutes, Ethan had packed emergency supplies into his old military field bag while smoke thickened across Black Hollow. The air already carried the sharp chemical smell of burning sap and hot pine needles. The fire was moving fast, too fast. As Ethan and Shadow crossed the lower trail toward Clearwater Basin, distant helicopter rotors echoed faintly somewhere beyond the smoke. The sound hit Ethan like a punch. Suddenly he was back in Afghanistan again. Mountain smoke, rotor wash, men yelling over radios, bodies carried through firelight. His pulse spiked violently. Breathing shortened. The trail beneath his boots became another mountain half a world away. Not here. Not now. Shadow slammed hard against his leg. The impact nearly knocked Ethan sideways. The shepherd barked sharply once, eyes locked on him, grounding him, pulling him back. Ethan forced air slowly into his lungs. One breath, then another. The helicopters remained distant overhead. Civilian fire crews. Not war. Not war. "You're good," he muttered to himself hoarsely. Shadow stayed close until Ethan's breathing steadied again. Then they kept moving. The basin below had become a nightmare by late afternoon. Wind drove smoke through the trees in rolling black waves. Ash fell constantly now. Burning pine cones dropped from branches overhead like small grenades exploding against the forest floor. Ethan shouted repeatedly as they moved through the smoke. "Forest Service! Call out if you hear me!" No response. Then Shadow froze. The shepherd turned sharply uphill toward a narrow ravine hidden behind thick timber, barking. Hard. Ethan followed immediately. The smoke thickened until visibility dropped to barely 30 feet. His eyes burned. Every breath tasted like charcoal and heat. Then he heard it. Crying. Children. Two small figures huddled beneath a fallen log near the ravine wall. A boy and girl no older than 12. Terrified. Covered in soot. The girl looked up first and burst into tears when she saw Ethan. "Please help us," she gasped. "Where are your parents?" "Campground," the boy coughed. "We got separated." The wind roared suddenly through the ravine. Above them came a sound Ethan recognized instantly. Fire crown, the trees themselves igniting. "Move!" Ethan shouted. The ridge exploded into flame behind them. Orange fire rolled through the treetops with horrifying speed, leaping from pine to pine in roaring waves. Heat slammed into the ravine hard enough to steal breath from Ethan's lungs. He grabbed the girl's hand while the boy clung to Shadow's harness. Then they ran. Smoke swallowed the trail almost instantly. Branches crashed, burning into the forest around them. Embers swirled through the air like angry insects. Somewhere nearby, propane tanks exploded from abandoned campsites with dull, booming reports. The children cried openly now. Ethan kept moving. One step, then another. Get downhill, reach water, survive. But the fire was moving faster. The western ridge vanished completely beneath flames. And suddenly, Shadow stopped. The shepherd spun once toward the smoke behind them, then bolted back uphill. "Shadow!" The dog disappeared instantly into the fire haze. The children stared in panic. Ethan's stomach dropped. "No!" he shouted again. Nothing. Only fire roaring through timber. For one terrible moment, Ethan stood frozen between instincts. Go after the dog. Protect the children. The old battlefield paralysis surged through him again. That awful feeling of being forced to choose who lives first. Then the boy grabbed Ethan's sleeve. "Please!" Ethan forced himself forward. He led them downhill through smoke thick enough to erase the world entirely. Several times he nearly lost the trail. Once a burning branch crashed across the path only feet ahead. Still no shadow. By the time they reached the shoreline near Black Hollow Lake, Ethan's throat burned raw from smoke and fear. The children collapsed near the water, coughing violently. Ethan turned toward the forest again. "Shadow!" Nothing answered. The fire advanced through the trees above the basin in rolling waves of orange light. Smoke blackened the entire western sky. Ethan felt something inside him breaking. Not the mission focus, not the training, something deeper. Because Shadow was not just a dog. Shadow was the last living thing that still knew who Ethan used to be before the war hollowed him out. And now the mountains had taken him too. Then movement burst from the smoke. Shadow. The shepherd stumbled through the burning haze, limping badly, fur singed along one side, dragging something behind him. A child. Another little boy. No older than 8. Alive. The boy clung weakly to Shadow's harness, while the old shepherd half pulled, half guided him through the smoke toward the lake. Ethan ran forward instantly. Relief hit so hard it nearly dropped him to his knees. Easy, easy. Shadow collapsed the moment he reached the shoreline, panting hard, exhausted. Ethan knelt beside him immediately, hands shaking as he checked the dog for injuries. Burns along the shoulder, paw bleeding, smoke inhalation. But alive, still alive. The rescued boy wrapped both arms around Shadow's neck while crying openly into the shepherd's burned fur. "He found me," the child whispered. Ethan swallowed hard. Above them, helicopters finally thundered into the basin through the smoke while emergency crews rushed toward the shoreline from the eastern trail. But Ethan barely heard them. He sat there beside the freezing black lake, with one hand buried in Shadow's fur, while fire consumed the western ridge beyond the trees. Walter Grady had died trying to save people from this exact nightmare. And now, 40 years later, an old military dog had done the same thing. Shadow lifted his tired head slowly and rested it against Ethan's chest. For a long moment, neither moved. Because somewhere deep inside Ethan, beneath the trauma and grief and years of running from himself, something broken had finally started healing. Not through peace, not through silence, but through loyalty strong enough to walk straight back into fire. The wildfire burned for 3 more days across the western ridges above Black Hollow. Helicopters thundered endlessly through the smoke-choked valleys carrying water buckets from nearby lakes, while exhausted fire crews carved containment lines through timber and ash. Entire sections of forest vanished beneath blackened earth and drifting embers. At night, the mountains glowed deep orange beneath rolling smoke clouds that turned the sky into something unreal. But Black Hollow Ranger Station survived. Barely. The fire stopped less than half a mile west of the lake basin after winds shifted north during the 3rd night. Burned trees still smoldered along the ridgeline afterward, their trunks glowing faintly red in darkness like dying coals scattered through the forest. Ethan spent most of those days caring for Shadow. The old shepherd's burns were not life-threatening, but they were painful. Fur along his left shoulder had burned away in patches, exposing raw pink skin beneath. One paw remained wrapped carefully in gauze from a deep cut, sustained while crossing sharp rock near the fire line. Shadow never complained. Military dogs rarely did. Still, Ethan saw the pain every time the shepherd shifted position beside the stove or tried standing too quickly after sleeping. The nearest veterinarian sat nearly 70 miles away, beyond mountain roads, partially closed by fire crews. So Ethan treated the injuries himself, using old field medical kits and everything he remembered from deployment trauma training. Slowly, carefully. The way Shadow had once stayed beside wounded soldiers overseas. Now it was Ethan's turn. On the 4th morning after the fire, sunlight finally returned fully to Black Hollow. The storm smoke cleared overnight, revealing blue sky so sharp and bright it almost hurt to look at after days beneath ash clouds. Snow still clung to the high granite slopes above the valley, untouched and brilliant against the burned western ridge. The contrast unsettled Ethan. Half the mountain blackened, half untouched. Life and destruction standing side by side. He stepped onto the porch, carrying a cup of coffee, while Shadow limped slowly behind him. The clearing smelled of wet ash and pine sap warming beneath sunlight. Black Hollow Lake reflected the mountains perfectly again. Peaceful, silent, as though the fire had never happened. But the forest remembered. The burned ridgeline above the basin looked scarred now, stripped raw and skeletal against the sky. Dead smoke drifted lazily upward from fallen timber farther west. Ethan rested one hand gently against Shadow's neck. "You saved those kids." Shadow looked up briefly, then back toward the mountains. No pride, no understanding of heroism, only duty. That simplicity broke Ethan's heart a little, because people complicated loyalty until it disappeared beneath fear and ego and self-preservation. Dogs never did. Later that afternoon, Ethan began repairing damage around the station. The woodshed needed rebuilding where the attacker's fire had blackened half the structure. Several roof shingles had torn loose during the storms. Smoke residue coated the tower windows from the wildfire passing nearby. Work steadied him, always had. The simple physical rhythm of repairing broken things quieted the noise in his head better than any medication ever managed. Shadow followed slowly behind him despite the limp, refusing to stay inside. By sunset, Ethan moved indoors to repair fire damage near the old stone fireplace where sparks from the storm winds had blown ash through cracks in the chimney. The station glowed warmly beneath lantern light again, almost homelike. That thought surprised him. Home. He had not used that word seriously in years. Ethan knelt beside the fireplace, scraping loose mortar from between the stones, when his tool struck something hollow behind the chimney wall. He froze, tapped again. Definitely hollow. Shadow immediately raised his head from beside the stove. Ethan set the tool down and examined the stonework more closely. One section near the lower left side of the chimney had been repaired differently than the rest. The mortar color mismatched slightly beneath decades of soot. Someone had sealed something inside the wall. His pulse quickened. Carefully, Ethan pried loose the outer stones one by one. Dust spilled into the firelight. Then his fingers touched metal. A narrow steel box rested hidden inside the chimney cavity, wrapped tightly in oilcloth, blackened by age and smoke. Shadow rose slowly and crossed the room toward him, watching. Ethan carried the box carefully to the table beneath the lantern. The lock had long since rusted away. Inside rested only one object, a weathered leather envelope. Ethan stared at the handwriting across the front for several seconds before opening it. To the next man who chooses to stay. Walter Grady. The station fell completely silent around him. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. Ethan unfolded the letter carefully. The paper had yellowed with age, edges brittle from decades hidden inside the chimney wall. Walter's handwriting slanted unevenly across the page beneath faint smoke stains. "If you found this, then either the station survived longer than I expected, or you're the kind of stubborn fool these mountains eventually collect." Ethan felt something tighten unexpectedly in his throat. Walter wrote the way some lonely men speak after too many years without company. Honest, direct, without performance. "I used to think isolation changed a man because it made him lonely. Truth is, the mountains don't make you lonely. They make you honest." Outside, evening light faded slowly across Black Hollow Lake. Ethan kept reading. "Up here, there's nowhere to hide from yourself, no crowds to disappear into, no noise loud enough to drown memory. Eventually, the silence strips you down until all that's left is whatever kind of man you really are." Shadow settled beside Ethan's chair while the lantern flame flickered softly against the walls. Walter's words continued. "Some men can't survive that kind of silence. Others belong to it." Ethan stopped breathing for a moment, because suddenly the station no longer felt random. Not the purchase, not the journey, not even finding Walter. It felt chosen somehow, not by fate, by understanding. Walter had known exactly what kind of men ended up in places like Black Hollow. The letter continued for several more pages. Walter wrote about storms rolling over the ridges in winter, about mornings when the lake turned perfectly still beneath snowfall, about spending months without hearing another human voice and eventually realizing he preferred it that way. Then, near the end, the tone changed. The county made its decision before the fire even started. They just needed somebody left behind to carry the blame afterward. Ethan's jaw tightened. Walter knew. He knew they would bury him. Yet he stayed anyway. The final page trembled slightly in Ethan's hands. If you found this station and stayed anyway, then maybe the mountains were saving it for you. The sentence shattered something inside him. Without warning, tears hit him hard enough to blur the lantern light completely. Ethan lowered his head slowly. For years he had carried grief like concrete inside his chest. Heavy, permanent, untouchable. He survived by burying everything beneath motion and distance and silence. But Walter's words cut straight through all of it. Because Ethan understood now. The wilderness had not healed Walter by removing pain. It healed him by removing everything false around it. The mountains forced honesty, and the honest truth was that Ethan had spent years believing he was too damaged to belong anywhere ever again. Too angry, too broken, too haunted. But Black Hollow had not rejected him. It had opened its doors. The station waited. Walter stayed. Shadow came back through fire. And somehow, against all reason, Ethan was still alive too. The tears came harder then. Not loud, not dramatic, just years of exhaustion finally collapsing inward beside a warm fire in a forgotten ranger station deep beneath the mountains. Shadow rested his head quietly in Ethan's lap. Steady, present. Ethan buried one shaking hand in the shepherd's fur while the other still held Walter's final letter. Outside, night settled softly across Black Hollow. The burned western ridge glowed faintly silver beneath moonlight now. Wind moved gently through the pines surrounding the station. Somewhere far across the lake, a lone owl called once through the darkness. The world felt impossibly still. For the first time since Claire drove away 8 years earlier, Ethan allowed himself to stop fighting the grief long enough to simply feel it. Not weakness, not failure. Human. Walter Grady understood that before he died. Maybe that was the final truth hidden inside Black Hollow. Not government corruption, not buried evidence, but the simple fact that wounded men sometimes survive by finding places quiet enough to hear themselves again. Ethan wiped his face slowly and looked down at Shadow. You knew before I did, didn't you? The old shepherd's tail moved once against the floorboards. Outside, moonlight touched the lookout tower high above the trees. And for the first time since arriving at Black Hollow, Ethan no longer felt like the station was watching him. It felt like the station had finally accepted him. The mountains changed after the fire. Not physically at first. The ridges still stood where they always had. Snow still clung to the granite peaks above Black Hollow. The lake still reflected morning light, like polished glass beneath drifting fog. But the silence felt different now. Lighter somehow. As if the wilderness itself had finally exhaled after carrying Walter Grady's buried truth for 40 years. Ethan noticed the change in himself, too. The nightmares came less often. When helicopters crossed distant valleys now, his hands still tightened automatically, but the panic no longer swallowed him whole. Some invisible knot inside his chest had loosened beside that fireplace the night he found Walter's letter. Not healed. Maybe wounds like his never fully healed, but steadier, more human. Shadow recovered slowly as summer settled into the bitterroots. Fresh fur began growing over the burns along his shoulder. The limp faded day by day until he could once again patrol the clearing around Black Hollow, with quiet confidence, pausing occasionally near the lake shoreline to watch birds drift across the water. Ethan caught himself smiling sometimes while watching him, a strange feeling after so many years of simply surviving. 3 weeks after the fire, Ethan finally drove back into Elk River carrying copies of Walter's tapes, journals, and the hidden letter from the chimney sealed carefully inside a weatherproof case. The town already buzzed with rumors. The wildfire rescue had spread fast through surrounding counties after the 2 children told emergency crews about the old military dog who pulled them out of the smoke. By the time Ethan parked outside Martha's kitchen, several people on the street recognized Shadow immediately. An older woman near the grocery store pointed toward the shepherd. "That's him," she whispered softly to her husband. The diner fell almost silent when Ethan entered. Not fearful silence, respectful. Martha came around the counter and hugged him before he could react. "You stubborn old mountain ghost," she muttered. "You had half this town scared to death." Ethan blinked in surprise. "I'm all right. I know that now." Shadow accepted a plate of bacon from one of the waitresses like a decorated veteran returning from war. Eli Turner sat near the window as usual. The old firefighter looked older somehow after the fire, tired beneath the eyes. But when Ethan placed Walter's letter carefully onto the table beside the tapes, something fierce lit behind Eli's expression again. "It's time," Ethan said quietly. And it was. The state investigators arrived 2 days later. Then reporters. Then wildfire historians from Boise. What began as a small local inquiry exploded outward once the recordings became public. Walter Grady's voice spread across television broadcasts and newspaper articles throughout Montana and Idaho. "If anybody finds this, tell them I stayed." People listened to that sentence and understood immediately. A man had died trying to save lives while officials protected themselves. And for 40 years, nobody bothered correcting the lie. The town of Elk River split almost overnight. Some locals rallied around Ethan. Others hated him for reopening old wounds buried beneath decades of silence. Arguments erupted inside the diner. Men who had spent their entire lives avoiding the subject suddenly shouted across coffee cups about county corruption and dead firefighters and whether the truth still mattered after 40 years. Martha handled most of it with the same tired wisdom she used on drunks and broken truckers. "Truth don't expire just because people get comfortable," she told one angry customer before calmly asking him to leave. Deputy Ron Kessler disappeared for several days after the investigation began. When he finally returned to town, reporters surrounded him outside the county office building. By then, the state investigators had already uncovered archived emergency records, proving Walter Grady's warnings had been intentionally ignored during the 1984 fire evacuation. Worse still, county leadership altered official reports afterward to protect themselves from lawsuits. Kessler's father signed some of those documents personally. The deputy resigned quietly 3 days later. No dramatic speech. No apology. Just a typed statement left at the sheriff's office before he drove out of Elk River alone beneath gray morning rain. Ethan watched him leave from outside the diner. For a brief moment, he almost felt sorry for the man. Ron Kessler spent his entire life protecting his father's reputation, only to discover he had been guarding a lie built on dead men. Some inherit money. Some inherit ghosts. The town held a memorial service for Walter Grady the following Sunday beside the small volunteer fire station overlooking the valley. More people attended than Ethan expected. Retired firefighters, Forest Service workers, local families. Even some of the men who once defended the county now stood quietly beneath the cold mountain wind while Walter's final recordings played through old speakers near the memorial table. Eli Turner spoke briefly. His voice shook. "Walter Grady stayed when others ran," the old firefighter said. "And because he stayed, people lived long enough to tell the truth." Nobody applauded afterward. The mountains themselves seemed too solemn for applause. Instead, Silence settled across the crowd, while smoke from nearby burn scars drifted faintly through the valley. Ethan stood near the back beside Shadow. He preferred it there, but several people approached him afterward anyway. A father whose children survived the wildfire shook Ethan's hand with tears in his eyes. A retired Marine quietly thanked him for bringing one of our own home. An elderly woman pressed homemade dog biscuits into Shadow's mouth while crying openly into her gloves. Ethan accepted all of it awkwardly. Gratitude still felt unfamiliar. Late that afternoon, after most people left, Martha found Ethan standing alone behind the fire station, watching clouds gather over the western ridge. "You did a good thing," she said softly. Ethan shrugged. "Walter did the hard part." "No." Martha stepped beside him. "Walter died trying. You stayed long enough to make people listen." The words settled heavily inside him, because staying had always been the hardest part. After the war, Ethan ran from nearly everything: his marriage, his daughter, himself. Movement became survival. Never stop long enough for memory to catch you. But Black Hollow forced him to stop, and somehow stopping saved him. That evening, he returned to the ranger station, exhausted beyond words. The mountains glowed purple beneath approaching dusk, while cold wind moved through the pines around the lake. Shadow limped slowly beside him up the porch steps, carrying one final biscuit, carefully in his mouth like treasure. Inside the station, Ethan lit the lanterns and built a fire while darkness settled outside. Then he noticed the envelope. It rested alone on the wooden table near the stove. No stamp, no return address, just his name written carefully across the front in familiar handwriting. Ethan froze. For several seconds, he simply stared at it, because he recognized the writing immediately. Claire, his daughter. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the envelope. Inside rested a folded newspaper clipping about Walter Grady and Black Hollow Ranger Station. Alongside it was a short handwritten note. "Dad, I saw the story on television. I almost didn't recognize you at first. You looked different. Not angry, not lost. I don't know if we can fix everything. Maybe some things stay broken too long for that. But I'd like to see you, if you want that too. Claire." Ethan lowered the letter slowly. The station remained completely silent except for soft, crackling firewood inside the stove. 8 years. 8 years since he last saw her standing beside the front door of their old house crying, while he packed another duffel bag and convinced himself leaving would hurt less than staying. He had spent years believing Claire was better off forgetting him. Now suddenly she wanted to come. Not because he begged, not because he apologized, because somewhere through all the smoke and grief and mountains, she had seen a version of him worth returning to. Ethan sat heavily beside the fire. Shadow crossed the room immediately and rested his head against Ethan's knee. "You hear that?" Ethan whispered hoarsely. The old shepherd's tail thumped softly against the floorboards. Outside, wind moved gently across Black Hollow Lake beneath a sky slowly filling with stars. And for the first time in longer than Ethan could remember, the future no longer looked empty. Winter arrived early in the Bitterroots that year. By late November, the upper ridges disappeared beneath deep snowfields that glowed pale blue under moonlight. The pines around Black Hollow carried heavy white blankets along their branches, and the lake slowly froze from the shoreline inward until thin sheets of ice stretched across the dark water like fractured glass. The mountains became quieter in winter. Not dead. Listening. Every sound carried farther through the cold. Ravens calling from distant ridges, wind brushing snow from pine limbs, the steady crunch of boots crossing frozen ground, and sometimes, late at night, the old lookout tower creaking softly above the trees, like a ship riding slow, invisible waves. Ethan grew to love those sounds. The ranger station no longer felt abandoned now. It felt lived in. The repaired woodshed stood solid again beside the clearing, stacked high with split pine and cedar for the winter months ahead. Fresh mortar lined the fireplace stones where Ethan repaired the chimney completely before the heavy snows arrived. New lantern glass glowed warm behind the front windows each evening, visible across the frozen lake like a small, stubborn beacon against the wilderness darkness. Inside, the station carried the smell of coffee, old books, firewood, and dog fur. Home. The word no longer frightened him. Shadow recovered almost fully by December. A faint scar remained beneath the fur along his shoulder where the fire burned him, and colder mornings made him favor one front paw slightly. But the old shepherd still patrolled the clearing every dawn, like he considered the entire mountain his responsibility. Maybe he did. Ethan rebuilt the fire lookout cab slowly throughout the autumn. The work took weeks. New window panes hauled carefully up the ladder one at a time. Rust scraped from the steel braces beneath freezing winds. Fresh wiring connected to the old underground generator Walter Grady once used during the fires. The tower became more than a project. It became a promise. Not only to Walter, to himself, because restoring things mattered. Not everything broken stayed broken forever. Some things simply waited for someone stubborn enough to rebuild them. Snow fell steadily 3 days before Christmas. Large, quiet flakes drifting through the valley without wind. Ethan woke before dawn that morning and found Shadow already sitting beside the front window, watching snowfall gather softly across the frozen lake. "You hear something?" Ethan asked. Shadow's ears lifted. Then came the distant sound. An engine. Faint. Far below the southern ridge. Ethan's pulse quickened unexpectedly. For a moment, fear touched him before hope replaced it. He stepped outside into ankle-deep snow just as pale winter sunlight began filtering through the clouds. The truck appeared nearly 20 minutes later, climbing slowly along the old access trail toward Black Hollow. Snow chains rattled against frozen rock, while the vehicle crawled carefully through the trees. Ethan stood motionless beside the porch, Shadow beside him. The truck finally stopped near the clearing edge. The driver's door opened slowly. Claire stepped out. For a second, neither moved. 8 years collapsed strangely in silence between them. She looked older than the last time Ethan saw her. Not old, just weathered by life the same way he had been. Dark winter coat, knit gloves, auburn hair partially hidden beneath a wool cap dusted with snow. But her eyes remained exactly the same. His daughter. Ethan suddenly realized his hands were shaking. Claire noticed too. For one terrible second, he feared she might turn around and leave. Instead, she smiled softly. "You really bought a ranger station in the middle of nowhere." Ethan let out a rough breath that almost became a laugh. "Guess I did." Shadow crossed the clearing first. The old shepherd limped through the snow toward Claire with slow, deliberate steps until he reached her boots. Then he sat heavily and looked up at her exactly the way he used to after she returned home from school years ago. Claire's face broke instantly. "Oh, Shadow." She dropped to her knees in the snow and wrapped both arms around the shepherd's neck while tears filled her eyes. Shadow licked her cheek once, then rested against her quietly. Ethan looked away toward the mountains for a moment, because suddenly he could not trust his own expression. Claire finally stood again, wiping her face. "You look different," she said quietly. "So do you." She glanced toward the station. "That really where you live now?" "Yeah." "By choice?" Ethan nodded once. Something about that answer seemed to matter deeply to her. They carried her bags inside together. The station glowed warmly against the winter cold. Fire crackled inside the stove. Snow tapped softly against the windows while evening slowly gathered beyond the clearing. Claire turned slowly aside the main room, taking everything in. Walter's maps, the repaired shelves, the journals, the lantern light. This place feels... She searched for the word. Alive? Ethan offered. She looked at him in surprise. Yeah. For a while, conversation came awkwardly. Careful, like both of them crossing unstable ice. They drank coffee beside the fire while Shadow slept between them on the floor, occasionally lifting his head whenever either voice changed tone too sharply. Eventually, Claire spoke first. I used to hate you. Ethan stared into the fire. I know. I thought you chose the war over us. The honesty hurt because it was partly true. Not the war itself, but the numbness afterward. The running. The inability to stay close to anyone once the darkness settled inside him. I didn't know how to come home, he admitted quietly. Claire looked down at her hands. Mom said that once. Silence settled again, but softer now. Outside, snow continued falling steadily across Black Hollow. Ethan finally stood and crossed to the shelf beside Walter's journals. He picked up the old ranger's final letter carefully and handed it to Claire. You should read this. She sat near the lantern while snowlight reflected faintly through the windows behind her. Ethan watched her expression change slowly as she moved through Walter's words. The mountains don't make you lonely. They make you honest. Claire read the final page twice, then lowered the letter slowly. He sounds like you. Ethan shook his head. No, he figured things out sooner. Claire studied him quietly across the firelight. I think maybe you did too. The words hit harder than she probably realized. Because for years, Ethan believed his daughter only remembered the worst version of him. The angry version. The absent version. The man who sat awake at kitchen tables at 3 a.m, staring at walls while trying not to drown inside his own head. But now she was looking at him differently. Not fixed. Not healed. Human. And somehow still worth finding. Later that evening, they climbed the lookout tower together, beneath a sky crowded with winter stars. The cold air cut sharp against Ethan's lungs while snow creaked beneath their boots. Shadow followed carefully behind, despite his stiff leg, refusing to remain below alone. At the top, the restored lookout cab glowed softly beneath the lantern Ethan had hung inside earlier that week. Claire stepped inside first, then stopped completely. The view stretched forever. Moonlit mountains rolling endlessly beneath snow and pine and silver frozen lakes. Smoke from distant chimneys far below in Elk River. Stars sharp enough to feel close. It's beautiful, she whispered. Ethan nodded quietly. For years, I thought I disappeared up here because I was broken. Claire looked at him. And now? He glanced toward Shadow sitting beside the observation window, watching the wilderness below exactly the way he once watched desert valleys overseas. Now I think maybe this place just waited until I was ready to stay. The wind moved gently around the tower. Below them, Black Hollow Ranger Station glowed warm beside the frozen lake like something protected rather than forgotten. Claire stepped closer beside him. Not awkward now. Not distant. Just present. And for the first time in nearly a decade, Ethan no longer felt like a man standing outside his own life looking in. As night deepened over the Bitterroots, Ethan climbed down from the tower with Claire and Shadow beside him, while snow drifted softly through the lantern light. The old shepherd paused once near the porch steps and looked back toward the mountains behind them. Standing watch. Faithful to the very end. Above the trees, the restored lookout lantern burned steadily across Black Hollow Valley for the first time in 40 years. And somewhere beyond the frozen wilderness, beneath stars shining over the mountains, Walter Grady once loved enough to die protecting. The light carried quietly through the darkness. A signal. A promise. Proof that some forgotten places do not wait to be found. They wait to save whoever finally arrives. If you believe loyalty still matters and some people are worth standing by no matter what, type "stay" in the comments. And tell us where you're watching from tonight. We always love hearing from folks across this country. Out here in the mountains, Ethan learned that broken things can still find purpose again. And maybe a lot of us need that reminder sometimes. If stories about courage, second chances, and loyal dogs mean something to you, subscribe and come back for more stories from the forgotten corners of America.